So I've divided up today's discussion into a few themes, which will appear behind us as I smoothly change the PowerPoint. So as Gretchen's kindly introduced us, my role here is to stimulate and really allow for that open, accessible, respectful discussion. So I thank you all for helping me to be able to do that. Not to give too much of an introduction because we are here to hear from the speakers, but I think it's worth saying that for those of you who may be new to abolitionist politics, to know that abolition is about collective freedom. And some of you may have heard about abolition in relation to the police, or have an image of abolition in relation to emancipation of enslaved people. But we are already living abolition. It's not a construct or a theory that is far removed from us or from our everyday existence. And to be an abolitionist simply means that you believe that we can do better for each other and for our world. It means that we accept there are critical flaws in our system, in our belief and knowledge systems specifically, and that the current system we live within thrives and survives on the idea that every other possible system is worse. So if you really ask yourself, do you genuinely believe that every other possible way of existing is worse than this? And that's what today is about. So just before we begin, I just want to ask everyone to close their eyes, if you can, if that's okay. So we can all close our eyes. Colleagues on Zoom as well, I won't be checking, but please, if you can, close your eyes to start. And if we just take a moment to stare into the darkness of our mind, just taking a moment and thinking about seeing that darkness. And if we see darkness, or do we actually see a blank canvas for creation? One that we can access at any point. All we have to do is close our eyes. And I want us to all be ready to visualize and create, and know that we can come back to this space and close our eyes and that we're there. Thank you. So if you open your eyes now, everyone. Thank you very much. Okay, great. That's a nice smooth transition. Brilliant. So this brings me to my first question for the panelists. I like to start with a little bit of I guess like a mindfulness meditation experience to help us understand what abolition means for our body. And that's kind of where I want to start with all of you today. The question that I'd like to pose is, what does your body feel like when you think about abolition? And what does it mean to you in a kind of somatic sense? Quite a big question, but I think that's quite an interesting one to start on. Can I come to you, Lola, to start with your smiling? Thank you.
I first want to say a huge thank you to the Centre for the invitation and also the opportunity to be in conversation with Reed and Scott. It's really great to have all of you here. Yeah, this is a huge question, I think, for me, and one that was meaty when I was thinking about it. And I guess the first thing that kind of came to mind was thinking about the relationship between the body and landscape. So like, obviously it follows that in transformed material conditions, the way that we think and feel, breathe, move, the way we interact with each other would also be transformed. So in a way, I feel like I can't answer this question about the body and like abolition as an embodied feeling without thinking through what abolition means to me. And I guess like, I really follow, obviously, Ruth Wilson Gilmore's lead in saying that abolition is this process that helps us rethink the relationship between organized abandonment and organized violence. So thinking about like the arms of the state, policing, prisons, and how those are like extractive machines of our time, of our labor, of these things that make up our life. And yeah, I think about when I guess I think about the body, I think about what prisons do, what like policing does to people. We know obviously that it puts kind of inordinate amounts of harm on people and on their communities, but I think it dispossesses us ideologically, and also of our sense of like an embodied agency in the world as well. And so I think of abolition as like a determined resistance to that had something also to do with our effective relationships to building livable worlds, but also, I guess, surviving, but also reorganizing resource so that we might live kind of full and dignified lives, and rethinking the ways that all of the things that I've just said are somehow presented to us as an impossibility. So this idea of housing, education, making sure everybody's collective needs are met, right? Like that's a kind of a communist principle or a communist way of thinking about how our society could be reorganized. So when I think about what that feels in the body to, I guess, wrap it up, I think about how we don't yet have the resources to access that in the fullest possible sense. And abolition maybe is about getting us to what we could have.
Yeah, I love what you say. I'll also say thank you for having me here. I'm so excited to be in conversation with Lola and Reed and Natasha and all of you, hopefully who want to talk with us, but no pressure. I like what you were saying, Lola, about sort of the transformative landscape and thinking then about also like the body in space and how that might change. And one of the things that I think about, what has happened to us through this long process of like forcing capitalism on us and forcing the state on us has been to sever our relationship to the land and create a world around us that that places us in a particular way. So I have a few thoughts just thinking about embodiment. Like one is like my kind of maybe a silly thing, but I once wrote a poem thinking about my this pain that I've had in my hip since I was a teenager. And I was imagining if I could transform this, like the feeling is like it shrivels up, my like leg shrivels up in the kind of like knot. And I was like imagining the ability to like transform that shriveling into some other power. My vision of that was to melt policemen when I saw them on the street. I don't know why that came to me, but this idea of like just being like dissolving the embodiment of state violence, where I could. So that was like one kind of fantastical. The other sort of like way I often think about this is I like the idea that we have multiple timelines, and I often think that like since everything is so horrible that we are in the worst possible timeline, but to me that actually instead of like being a kind of negation gives me hope that there's other possibilities, because if we're in the worst possible timeline, like there's possible other worlds. And so I imagine this like shift, this jump, right? Like jumping a rail or something, like to get to another timeline where things are better. And I think about this also just sometimes in my like life and relationships when things are going wrong. Like I try to overlay the possibilities with the obstacles and imagine that something is still possible. So there's something there for me about sort of embodiment. The way I talk about it in this book, but I quote Thomas Pynchon in Crying of Lot 49 about this anarchist miracle of two worlds kind of touching, like two pool balls. And I like that idea too, this kind of like kiss, I think he calls it, of pool balls. So yeah, the other thing I just want to say is just like as a trans person, like I think that there's embodiment in abolition, and I'm the kind of trans person who thinks about gender abolition, which isn't all trans people, but like the process of transition is an embodied change, an abolition of perhaps the gender that is forcibly assigned on you at birth, and like imagining of other possibilities. So that's something I think another thing I would bring into the conversation.
Yeah, I really love what you both have to say, and again, yeah, I'm really honored to be on this panel with the three of you. Like, thank you very much for including me here. And yeah, when this question was initially posed to us, I was thinking a lot about, actually kind of similarly to Lola, her supposed to feel more concept of organized abandonment and like how organized organized abandonment is in part about the marking of like people as surplus and waste in capital, and like how that then has a geospatial component because those people are then removed or those spaces are cordoned off or made into carceral states, and like asking what does abolition feel like in the body. What that for me does is like someone who's policed by the states in a lot of ways, but not in the ways that like I think often come to the fore when we think about abolition. Like as a disabled trans person, like it actually alerts me to the pain in my body, kind of similarly to what you were talking about, Scott, as well. Like that thinking about abolition actually forces me to wonder what would it look like if we were able to listen to our bodies and receive care. And like that's not just true of like, you know, me, an American like disabled trans person living in the UK. Like it's also true to thinking of like all the ways that people have been removed from their bodies and their embodied experiences under the designation of surplus or waste, and like thinking about the ways that we are taken out of the body. Like I have been thinking a lot about this, about like how abolition actually alerts us to the material conditions that we all face, and recognizing like that our material conditions are different, and like saying like we actually have a shared struggle rather than individual ones, and like being alive to differences in that rather than like a competitive like zero-sum game or like trying to get at the cost of others. Yeah, I don't know if that hopefully answers things.
Thank you. Thank you. Doing a brilliant job at sharing the mic as well. So thank you very much. I made loads of notes, but I really like what you said about pain in the body, and something specifically that you said about Scott, about the physical pain that you feel in your body giving you some kind of like superpower and ability. And so for about a minute or so, just to invite everyone to think about the question for themselves, people on the Zoom and people in the room as well, whether you close your eyes, whether you exchange a few words with the person next to you, but just to think about how does your body feel in this exact moment. What are you carrying? What are you bringing to the space? Do you feel any pain in your body? And as we started to explore some of these concepts, what does the idea of abolition do to your body? How does it change your relationship with self and with the landscape, as has been mentioned here? So just invite everyone just to pause and really to take in what we kind of started to open up, because I think these are really deep and interesting things to pause on. So if that's okay. I'm just having a pause, don't worry. We're not just sitting inside. Great. So in the interest of time, I'm going to keep us going and just do smoothly transition. So one of the things that I wanted to bring to the conversation as well is how we are already living and embodying abolition and abolitionist politics in our daily lives, in our everyday existence, through our relationships with ourselves, our relationships with others, to the world around us, and etc. As well as being physically in this space. I feel like we're kind of generating that vibration and that frequency that is needed to invoke abolition as well. So my next question to the panelists is, can you talk to us a little bit about the last thing that you feel that you've abolished in your personal lives, whether that's through a stance that you've taken, an approach that you've taken, and to then lean in to think about what is the next thing you think as a society we need to abolish. And I can start from the other end, so maybe it doesn't always have to be letting it go with us. You can, yeah, I think you might just need to turn it on or test it. I'm just speaking the song. I don't know what it is.
Oh, no.
No.
I think you just need to push this button up, this one. Is that? Yeah? Okay.
Let's just
Yeah.
use this one.
Sorry. I think when I think about like something that I guess I don't want to say that I've ever abolished anything because like I do see louder, closer. Yes, okay, cool. Thank you. I don't ever want to say that I fixedly abolished anything in my life, like particularly like considering how much abolition is a project against white supremacy. Like as a white person, that's something that I'm always going to be working against and unlearning and moving through while we live in a society that is defined and shaped by white supremacy. But something that I've been thinking about a lot, and sort of similar to what you said earlier, Lola, is landscape and the way that we often racialize the landscape and its uncoded or incredibly coded ways, like, you know, thinking about, and I've worked both in my like PhD research, but also intentionally in myself, like thinking about what spaces I see as safe and what spaces I do not see as safe. And that like, I think that that is a project that gets often not always talked about in the forum. We talk about thinking about what gaze we use when we look at a landscape and what we see as a space that is safe and therefore either in like a white sort of spatial imaginary heavily policed because it's demarked as unsafe because it's like say dirty or messy or unclean or damaged according to like what a white supremacist spatial imaginary dictates, and like thinking about like what it feels like while I walk down a road that has like people on it and like how I'm taught to engage with those people or not engage with those people and not witness their lives, or like, you know, there's a high road near me where like a new wine bar has opened up and like seeing how that space is visually different from the other shops around it and like recognizing that that is a process of gentrification and the introduction of more policing into my neighborhood. And so like working to abolish sort of the like aesthetic colonization of my mind that whiteness has enacted on me and how that manifests in my relationship to safety.
I think likewise, I wouldn't want to claim successful abolition in the midst of like a struggle, right? Where there's people who are kept in cages, you know, where we're under this racial colonial regime. So like, I'm not ready to pat myself on the back of having abolished things. But like one way I think about this in terms of like, you know, there's this larger struggle, like I want to abolish prisons and the police and the state and capitalism, race and gender, all these things like that are, I find to be all linked, right? So it's like, you don't just get rid of one of them. And we also need to like survive within this current system. But like, what do we do in our daily lives and how can we embody some kind of abolitionist stance in relationship to each other? One thing I think about is refusing roles that are put on us. So, you know, building off of what Reed was saying, you know, there's ways that you are expected to behave, whether it's on the street or in your job or as in a classroom. I don't know, to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore again, I mean, she talked about everyone being sort of on guard duty, right? Like that there's a lot of policing that goes on between us and among us when we don't need to be doing that, right? So there's all these opportunities to kind of refuse to play a role. And so for me, like as a teacher, for example, that's one place where I think about it, like the way that I approach evaluation of students, and try not to kind of impose hierarchies and you know, give them the accreditations that they need for whatever they're looking for example, you know, but also just sort of like in other more mundane ways of thinking about the like hierarchies that you might embody in certain situations, how you can kind of subvert them or refuse them. And for me, like refusal again, like I don't know, I think we probably all having studied some of the same abolitionists, like abolition sounds like it's taking away something, but it always has to like be paired with building something up. So for me, refusing open space to engage otherwise, which I think is very important.
Yeah, I think just following on from that, I think this question made me kind of reflect on the ways that I've decided to do critique. I guess as somebody who is unfortunately doing a PhD, and in a way it made me think of Fanon's idea of like decolonization being this program of like complete disorder, and like that the idea of complete disorder is one that comes up a lot when we're thinking about abolition, because when people are attempting to do this work of like putting abolitionist principles out there, often they are met with people's own like effective attachments to order in every sense. Like the idea of saying abolish the police, abolish prisons scares people a lot. And so in my work, I guess in thinking about abolition as a presence, like I've been trying to think about which critiques I bring in and trying to sever those, like has been said before, those ideological ties, which I think often are the foreground or undergird the ability for these violent forces to continue. Like there is in some sense, like a mass consent to be policed, a mass consent for prisons to exist. And I think a lot about in my own work how that, because I work on the imagination, and I guess I try to enact a critique of history. And I think one of the worst things about like a stadial approach to history or like Marxist historiography is this idea that life can only be thought of in terms of stages and in terms of like specific kinds of development. And I guess when I'm thinking about like what I have like quote unquote abolished or what I'm bringing in terms of my critique, I think in infusing my critique with the speculative or with some critique of linear histories and linear chronologies, I guess I'm trying to commit myself a bit more to that disorder that otherwise might also leak out into other aspects of my life as well. And I also think collective organizations are the best place to think about how a community or a group of people might be in a position to refuse or to enact a certain kind of disorder or to refuse to guard. And in that sense, there are loads of ways that those ideological attachments can be rendered, like towards the family, towards heteropatriarchy, towards this sense of like that there is a right way to exist in the world. So I think it's complicated and knotty, but I guess I see abolition as like the opposite to what like fascism, I guess, which is like to impose a right reproduction on us, to say here is the order. And abolition it gives us some tools, I think, to say no, actually disorder might make sure that our needs are met. Disorder mean that we don't get the things that we need, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I like where we've landed thinking about tools and disorder and how it will allow us to, well, it will kind of force us to keep reimagining when we don't have those imposed structures. So thank you for those reflections. That was really insightful. It kind of leads in really well to the next segment. Let's move my slide. And so in preparation for the discussion today, I made some notes on some of the things that we spoke about in the discussion meeting that we had. And it leads on from what you just mentioned, Lola. So I wrote down the need to abolish binary thinking. And then in the event program, you would have seen that we mentioned other areas like gender, family, property. So I wonder if we can expand our, as we are already, discussion to really thinking about some of the areas of society and systems and ways of living that we need to abolish and apply some abolition power to. So if I can come to Scott, because you haven't come there, and trying to make it equitable. Thank you.
as I was saying before, I think that all these things that we want to abolish are linked. So, you could ask what to start with, and there's a reason I think that there's like a current movement of abolishing prisons, because they're a specific location. The way that I think about the prison in relationship to the rest of the sort of so we live in like a carceral world. The prison locates a specific aspect of carcerality that allows a general carceral logic to kind of circulate in our world, right? So we can say, I'm not the only person who said this, obviously, but we can say like that over there is a prison, we're free over here, right? And so I think that's one of the important reasons why prison abolition is like a place to start. And then lately, like police abolition has become more of a movement, and I think that's also an extremely important place to think about, because for me, one of the things that gets left out a lot, particularly in certain forms of leftist thinking, is getting rid of the state, right? And if you get rid of the police, you can't have a state, because the state works by it needs enforcers, and the police are the enforcers of the state. And so I think a lot of people who've like gotten on the sort of train of abolishing the police maybe haven't yet thought about how that entails the state. But then, going down this like train, the family is like a mini state, right? It's a little place where people learn their place in the world and enact hierarchies. Even if you don't live in or weren't raised in a traditional family, we're kind of ruled by the idea of a family. So like, even though most people, I think at this point, aren't living in those. And so I like to think about like abolishing the family, and then alongside that, like the kind of hierarchy between adults and children, for example, which is like one of the places that we like very often assume that there's a right of adults to have control over children. And that would be like one of the places that would like totally upend our world if we actually had some kind of youth liberation. And I wanted to like go back to something that Lola was saying in terms of like disorder, because I was thinking when you were talking about history too, about Saidiya Hartman, right? So like from her first book, Scenes of Subjection, she talks about the non-event of emancipation, and how like after the supposed abolition of slavery in the United States, the now freed Black population was sort of what she calls burdened with a sense of individuality. But then in her most recent book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments. Okay, she shows how there's like a kind of subterranean like disorder, like ungovernability in Black life. Like she's particularly looking at the beginning of the 20th century, right? That goes it can't be recorded by the traditional forms of historiography, right? It shows up in the archive and in ways, and then she kind of reconstructs it. So like that, I think is important just to think about that, like abolish what exactly, there's a long project, but we also can take sort of like think about the places where we are already living out forms of ungovernability or disorder, to use the Fanonian term. Who shall I turn it to now?
Either good. All right. Okay. Yeah. So I really echo what you've been saying, Scott, particularly around like family evolution. I've been thinking a little bit about my research, how the idea of childhood is created as this site to protect, but is entirely entwined with like a suburban colonial project, and like the relationship that we have of viewing children as a form of property. And so yeah, I think that that's a really important axis of abolition. I also think like when we think about abolishing I think you said it really, really well in one of our early planning conversations about how the prison is sort of this place where all of these structures intersect and is a utopia of capital and the state. And like, I think one, prison abolition emerges sort of to take I initially trained as a historian. I can't help but want to do history. I think like the current prevalence of prison abolition and carceral abolition in our movements is also like obviously a huge legacy to the organizing that's being done for decades now, like in the UK around complex networks and the resistance, say, for example, at Broadwater Farm, which is near where I live, but also like the work of critical resistance in California and elsewhere now. But like, I guess when I think about abolish what else, I think I've been thinking a lot about like abolishing healthcare institutions, particularly as a trans person, as a disabled person, as a mentally ill person. But like that, a lot of, if we want to look into history for models of abolition, you know, the deinstitutionalization movement, particularly in the United States, like has some forms of modeling there that we can look to, and that like when we ask ourselves, you know, how do we continue the project of abolition sort of as a project that's ongoing while people are experiencing violence, like what can we do? Sort of the term that kind of brought up all the time now to an extent that I'm suspicious of using it is harm reduction. And the scholar Liat Ben Moshe writes about the concept between reformist and non-reformist reforms, or positive and negative reforms. And one of the examples that Ben Moshe uses is the argument of, you know, well, what would be a reformist reform would be putting healthcare systems in prisons, whereas a non-reformist reform would be insisting that incarcerated people be brought out of the prison to receive healthcare. And what I actually want to like start wondering about is what happens when we abolish the current healthcare systems that exist today in the US or in the UK into like actual conditions of care. And that would necessitate the abolition of prison, because we know that prison isn't a space where care is accessed or care is given. And so, yeah, like I'm interested in how these, I don't want to say fronts, but like avenues towards abolition of the state or capital actually all collapse when we get to the prison. And like, yeah, healthcare abolition has become a real core tenet of my politics, just because like, what does it mean that like healthcare is so restricted regardless of where you go? Having been raised in America and having had to fight for access because I do not have the means for it, or, you know, the capacity to drive, say, I'm a gay person that can't drive, and so therefore can't drive to like the specialist clinic to get the trans healthcare that I need in America, let alone pay for it. But here in the UK, like it's not a question of if I can't pay for it, it's a question of if the state will give it to me, which is a whole different realm of violence. And I'm curious about what happens when we look to say neither of these things are working, and what networks of solidarity can be built between that, and like what happens when we take the means from the state or capital to give ourselves health and care.
Yeah, I think you've both covered so much. I guess when you were talking, I was thinking about the border as well, and border abolition, because I think that abolition is a project that asks us to, I guess, reassess everything, but to also think about what the purpose of the nation state is and its relationship to the state proper, I guess. And if we think about policing prisons as these like violent arms of the state, the border is that I guess that line or that demarcation that keeps that violence contained in some sense. And so, yeah, so I guess the answer to what next in some sense is also that. But I guess I was also reflecting on how like one of the really powerful things about abolition as a political principle, I think, is that like it can't really go out of vogue in some sense. Like a lot of other political frames have limits. And I think that when we're talking about abolition, we're talking about total transformation, and that's a project that is never finished. So it, like you said, Natasha, requires imagination. It requires us to bring that which does not like previously exist into being, not only in our communities, but also in the ways that we engage with the world. And I think it also requires us to think about how the current tools and language we have to navigate the world really underserve our ambitions as people who have kind of capacious ideas about how we should live and be with one another, right? And so for me, like when I'm thinking about the ways that all of this violence is knitted together, it is useful, as you both said, to have this this kind of signpost to say, here is where the state kind of tucks away violence behind, you know, behind closed doors in some sense. But I think also when we're thinking about what to abolish next, we also have to think about how the carceral landscape kind of leaks out and leaks into everything, so that you know, when we're like crossing the border or when we're with our families or whatever, we're also engaged in a system that is kind of locked in all around us, I guess. And I guess the antidote to that is thinking about like as Ruth Wilson Gilmore also says, like freedom as a place, like freedom also as a location, because that helps us think that that location can be built, but that it can also be accessed, rather than constantly, I guess, having an idea of the thing that we want as an abstract notion. Yeah, I think this is a really like difficult question, but I find a lot of what has been said previously about care really important, and it was making me think of this thing that Tina Camp said of like care being an antidote and not just the treatment for the wound. And I was thinking a lot about what you both said about pain earlier on, and how all of these institutions that we have to navigate aren't invested in the creation of an antidote, because that would require a wholesale reevaluation of all of these other things, right? And so when you're only getting temporary relief in some sense constantly, when you're only kind of like stemming the flow of something, you're not really dealing with how dispossessed, how alienated our current structures make us. And that's a huge project. That's not one that anybody on this panel has the answer to, or one that we'll discover in 5-10 years. It's really about a deep commitment and a nurturing of a kind of political will. That's what I think of when I think of myself, I guess, as like a student of abolition.
Thank you, thanks so much. I realised I forgot to say that there is a Q&A coming, so if you do have questions, don't worry, we're not just going to be talking at you. Apologies, I did forget to say that. Thank you so much. Great, so everything's flowing so beautifully into the next transition of the slides topics, so that's fantastic. I'm doing my job well. So we're going to be thinking a little bit now about imagining otherwise. And because we're running just a few minutes ahead of schedule, which is good, there's going to be an audience task for those online as well. So don't worry, you haven't escaped that. So person next to you or behind you, in front of you, whoever is closest and you're able to speak to them if you feel comfortable, and online, if you can use the chat function as well to, excuse me, to help us set the tone for this next segment of our discussion. I'd really like some of us to start thinking about what alternative existences that we've already imagined, either in our minds or that we've spoken to others about, when we've come across a system or a service that didn't serve us. So we might have loads of examples, we might have none, but I think just start reflecting and really speaking about how that feels and what that meant for you. So I'll repeat that question again because I've said a lot of things. So what alternative existences have you already imagined in your head when you've come across a system or a service that didn't serve you? So you just have a moment to introduce yourself, the person next to you on the chat, also write the question out as well, into about 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you.
But you know, Natasha, people writing stuff you were telling you to
And like, and that's in the context of imagining like transition. It gets there, so like.
We'll have another minute on that, and then I'll bring it back in. So just another minute to finish off. Everyone can just bring their conversations to a lovely peaceful close. Fantastic. So I'd love, hopefully this isn't really loud. I'd love if anyone in the room, in the space, feels comfortable to share. I'd love to hear about some of your discussions. There's no pressure, you can anonymize anything that you're saying. But if you want to raise your hand, if you feel comfortable, if not, we'll read from the chat online. Anyone want to say anything? No, that's fine. Oh, yes, brilliant. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I was talking about, I think the most obvious one for me is about gender irrelevance. Something that I have experienced some oppression around, and it's actually the only way that I have been able to imagine the world without gender as an oppressive structure is actually through fiction. And so reading things like feminist science fiction, alternative utopias, things like this has enabled me to think differently. And I think that's indicative to me of how constrained my thinking is about some of these social structures.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Yeah, so the first thing that really comes to mind, well, first of all, just to introduce myself, DK, I'm doing my PhD at QS City. So the first thing that I'm thinking is about the educational system.
Yeah, it's like a very obvious example. First of all, as refugees, yeah, obviously we're not paid the amount that we deserve, and secondly, as a student, especially as international students who are on the tier 4 visa, and not EU students, who are paying a lot more. So obviously, this is not serving our purpose of like free access to education. And for me, I don't think education should be a privilege; it should be a right. So that's why it's not serving us. To be honest, I haven't really been thinking about the reimagined educational system, but I think first of all, it's about access. And now that we have more about the online education, the online courses that we can access, that could be maybe an alternative. And perhaps like if we could like remodel the educational system so that it's more like accessible, maybe different formats, and perhaps like because not everyone's English is a first language, it's might be a good idea to kind of think about like accommodating people from like different international backgrounds as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. We've got one more as well. Thank you.
And thank you. So me and Rita, I'm Jessie Cooper, I'm a senior lecturer here. Me and Rita were similar to yourself. We were talking about kind of abolishing like the university as an institution. And we didn't really know how that would look. We were talking about, you know, the need to abolish hierarchies and the money, the kind of capital that, like, you know, because we, you know, at the moment it's feel this isn't being recorded, is it?
Yeah, but we can.
Okay.
Work it out.
This is what it makes, you know, you feel like, so, you know, at the moment it feels, so I'm a permanent academic, so in many ways the system has kind of worked for me because I have got that holy grail of like a permanent position. But in that permanent position, what I'm struggling with now is just the violence that the system is doing to both students and staff. And it's like, it's a struggle that most weeks I will go home and cry about it, you know, and I don't know how that can be changed, but it needs to be abolished as a system. And as I say, that's somebody who gets paid by the system. You know, I think students are treated as capital and staff are treated as capital. And yeah, I mean, I think what else you were kind of saying, and yeah, we don't really know how that would look, or whether it would just mean a complete abolition of the education system altogether, rather than just these kind of new changes and then just keeps the system the same. But I don't really think it's serving anybody for the good at the moment. And actually, and to the extent where I have PhD students and I feel like they are coming into the system, that I'm just like, do you really want to come into this system? Sorry, because I know you know. I'm married with this.
Thank you.
Sorry, as someone who works in healthcare sometimes, one thing that I try and be proactively in imagination with is like, what does it look like for me to show up differently? With like feeling quite constrained and generally feeling quite hopeless about kind of what I can do to make change kind of at a broader systems level, is to just sort of help people that I'm working with to cut corners and to navigate the system in like marginally more humane ways. So what to say, what not to say, who to talk to, who not to talk to, like anything that I can do to like make sure a referral goes into the right hands, I will do that, even if it means like doing it outside of like, you know, work hours, because the way that the system keeps you, or my experience of the way that the system keeps you disabled and out of agency completely, is by, you know, through the bureaucracy and like the violence of commitments to like registration and how professionalism is taught and like hammered into me and those sorts of ways of like maintaining that control. But even though I work with families individually, like there's no one else in the room when I'm with a family, but all of those forces are so like they're very, very present. And I'm wearing a badge that makes certain claims about who I am and what my qualifications are, and how legitimate or not things I'm saying are, and like me being wedded to that identity and that power is part of then what like imprisoned me, because I have this like feeling of I have to honor these titles or whatever, and then they're literally up. Helping people on this.
Thank you. I think we've got one more in the back and then we'll have to move on.
Some on Zoom as well.
And then some on Zoom. I'll try and summarise for colleagues on Zoom if they haven't been able to hear that clearly.
Hi, my name is Nanya. They, them. I think I just wanted to say a fun one. Because I think it's also important to have lightness in these things. I think it's like when you're in like a social situation, so I'm very feminine, people often interpret me as a woman, and I'll be in a space and be like, oh, you're such a strong woman. And I'll be like, oh, well, actually, I'm not a woman. And there's that intervention there where like I'm now supposed to educate the person and be like, well, actually, I don't look like this, but like, there's lots of different ways someone who's not cisgender or is a woman or all these other things could be, but instead I'll just be like coming up with something ridiculous. So sometimes I'll be like, oh, I'm actually 2 boys in a trench coat. People are going to be like, oh, okay. And then change. You can like have this moment of like creative fun where you're like distorting or disorienting someone and sort of maybe putting them on a path where they might be able to do that work, but you don't actually have to exploit yourself in the process, right?
Thank you so much. We're going to see if we have any comments on Zoom as well, and then we'll proceed to the next part of the discussion. Thank you.
So on Zoom, we have two that I wanted to read out. Free public transport, of course, I agree. Also, ending group punishment and administrative abuse. This is in response to PBSP's application of group punishment. I don't know if anyone can clarify this, the PBSP, if anyone doesn't know who that is. Application of group punishment as a means to address individual inmates' rule violations. This includes the administration's abuse of pretextual or use of safety and concern to justify what are unnecessary punitive acts. This policy has been applied in the context of justifying indefinite isolation status and progressively restricting our programming and privileging. So that's a prison comment about the prison system. Collectivizing the university, the university being run collectively by students and others is also a suggestion. Okay.
Thank you so much to everyone for sharing and being vulnerable, because that's really hard to reflect on our own experiences and share them in the room. So thank you everyone for doing that. I'm going to bring it back to our lovely speakers who are with us as well to support us in answering that question. So I'll just repeat it again, since we've obviously gone through lots of other answers to round us in the discussion. So what I'd love to hear from all of you is about the alternative existences that you've imagined through your writing, through sharing with peers, with other abolitionists, and if you can lean on any other existing alternatives that we know are already existing in other communities, and also leaning into the idea that sometimes, sorry, this is a really long question, but I think just to say, sometimes we feel we have to think of something else, and then that stops us from pursuing the fact that what we currently have, we need to change. And I think sometimes just knowing that the present reality doesn't serve, and that we don't necessarily need to find one thing to fix for the future, because that can actually hinder us moving forward. So if you want me to repeat the question, because I have waffled, please let me know. But do you feel like that is kind of a clear prompt? Brilliant. Okay, so I'll hand over.
I'll try not to this in terms of alternative worlds. I think that as someone who's doing a kind of like practice-based PhD and someone who is a writer, I really feel like all forms of creativity add a different kind of texture to everyday life, right? Like they can really help us inflate the quotidian, they can help us think through it. And so it's no surprise that people find themselves able to access the possibilities of the different ways that we can live, for example, through fiction or through visual art, through audio, through sound, through movement. I think that I find my work and my writing like sits right in the middle between the like vulgar materialists who aren't interested in pleasure in any way and say, you know, that's a mistake and that we should never do that. And the utopians who are like really super invested in the building of these worlds, right? And I think that like what writing and creativity can help us do is open space for the development of our kind of attachments to resistance, our attachments to other worlds, but also the ideological severing that I was talking about before. And I also think, just kind of like in response to some of the things that people have been saying, like when you were talking about the university and the healthcare system and the prison in some sense and policing, these are all institutions of like huge financial like capital, like money flows through them. And I think in a way like abolition is also about us following the money and seeing how it circulates, right? So that more money is produced, and how those logics of what those logics of productivity rob us of, and how they are basically dependent on the exploitation of all of us, like a large group of people. And so, yeah, I think that in writing for me personally, that's the space where I do feel able or the most equipped to unpick that and to use, you know, different techniques, skills, playfulness, invention to claim the thing that I do absolutely want. And I think that for me, it's always twofold. Like I think of this thing that June Jordan said in this essay that she wrote about why she went to Nicaragua during the war. And she's like, you know, in America, you can get so bogged down, like writing all of these letters to the New York Times. But at the end of the day, you know that writing back is not the same as fighting back. And she's like, that's my logic. That's the reason why I had to go. And I think that like, I see my writing practice as absolutely connected to an organizing practice, an intellectual practice, that these two things work in tandem. You can't have, you know, just one, essentially. So yeah, so there is a real like special part and place in my heart, I think, for art before it becomes part of an art market. And you know, when you enter an art industry, then it's just the same kind of problems in terms of every institution. But I think there is still something about how viewing something, reading something, listening to something changes something in the doing. And I think that like anarchists are actually really good at this idea of rehearsal, that actually we needn't wait for the cusp or the moment, right? We can change our relations with each other in the present moment. And I think art helps us do that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Like one of the ways that I think about art, and you know, someone who teaches and also just like loves to read science fiction, but also like I like abstract art, right? One of the things I'm interested in is how we can create art that isn't reproducing the world as it is. Because you know, you might notice that a lot of the kind of like the highbrow forms of art are the things that are taken the most seriously are like realist, and that I think is something that kind of traps us within our imagination. So like to take that outside of the realm of art, well, I can give examples of like things that I love that, you know, imagine other worlds, but I'm interested in that as a practice, like you were saying, like something that anarchists do, like rehearsal, trying things out, playing around with things, but like because yeah, how we could take that also into our lives of like not reproducing the same all the time. I think that's really important as we get trapped you know, thinking a lot of people mentioned the university or just like their roles within in their jobs. Like there are all these little like switch points where you can try to consider other ways so that you're not playing the game that the way it's supposed to be played. So yeah, finding ways to kind of produce other worlds in the here and now, that's like the kind of anarchist prefiguration. The other thing that you know, just like in terms of imagining that I would put out there, something that I've been talking about and thinking about is how we can like repurpose spaces that we currently have. You know, I'm interested in this in terms of like city versus like rural spaces. Also just like the relationship between like what we call like humans and the rest of the world and the kind of bifurcation there. But like how could we create spaces kind of low intensity, low commitment connections is something I'm very interested in, because like there's like a way that if you like show up in a space like differently than when you come to a talk, right, or you go to a classroom and your attention is like demanded in a certain way, and you're there to kind of perform a role. Can we like create spaces that would allow for different kinds of possibilities of interaction? This is something, yeah, I think we can do, and I'm very interested in. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I think you both had really, really great points, and I think particularly like talking about anarchism and rehearsal and abolition and rehearsal brings forth this thing that a friend of mine said in my like first ever like baby's first foray into abolition reading group, where he is, you know, used to do a lot of theater in high school, and I'm also remembering that Reed Puc Gilmore started as a theater student, and he sort of said, it seems like abolition is like the improv game yes and, where you just keep going, which is kind of how I've always thought of it since then, that it's going yes and then adding on and doing that sort of rehearsal and experimentation until we find something that works, and recognizing that what works is going to be bespoke for each community and each situation, and allowing that multiplicity to exist. But I guess the question of like where I have found the otherwise is, you know, a lot of it, I can't not say like superhero comics, because it did do that for me in a lot of ways. And I'm, you know, a lot of my PhD is learning, oh, well, maybe not as much as I had hoped and dreamed they would be. But like, I do think about like how ultimately, like there are a lot of flaws within them, but say, for example, like X-Men comics are a really incredible space where like this otherwise opens up, because X-Men comics are kind of always about the autonomy that marginalized people have to take for themselves. And often, you know, thinking about something that I've been thinking about a lot tonight is how abolition as a practice, I find, needs to privilege the most fringe and marginal people in our world, because, you know, I think of there's a Dean Spade chapter in Captive Genders, which sort of talks about the idea that we're taught that everything is going to trickle down, but actually that like abolition asks us to think about things trickling up, and that if the most marginal have their needs met, then that means that everyone else is going to get their needs met as well. And so like thinking about the otherwise as a space where those who are told that they absolutely cannot get their needs met are centered in X-Men comics is sort of kind of the premise of my master's dissertation. But like thinking about the comment that you made about the non-human and the human as a binary, like something that I found quite moving in X-Men comics that I was reading as, you know, a teenager and a young adult, like was that this idea of, you know, who is a mutant and who is an X-Men doesn't exist in a human binary. It's like, oh, are you a weird alien that doesn't fit in the rest of your society? Well, guess what? You're an X-Men too. And like that actually does create a space potentially for us to like learn how to imagine otherwise. But like, I think in an attempt to kind of keep a theme of the landscape running through, a weird passion that I have is going to museums of former sites of incarceration and thinking about how we are asked to remember those spaces, and how the archive of the place functions and how we're asked to move through them. And I like thinking about the question that you're asking of like what happens when we apply abolition to spaces and like how we move through them. I'm really curious about like how we are choosing to remember sites of incarceration and violence as we move into the abolitionist world, and like what that would look like, and what does it mean, you know, when we take sites that were sites of violence and the stripping of people to their life and removal of people from their communities, and like how do we inhabit those spaces while honoring sort of the legacy of trauma that is within those spaces, is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't have any answers towards, but like we do always like to kind of hearken people to, just because it's something that comes up in the university, for example, when we like talk, when universities go look into their endowments and go, oh my God, we have made so much money off of violence and tracking and seizure and stealing of human beings. Or in America, something that's quite common is that most university building works are done by incarcerated peoples, and like how that is invisibilized within the institution. And so like thinking about how we move through these spaces and who is hidden by them, and like how to bring them to the fore while also transforming the conditions of violence that like are impacted on their lives and our own.
Can I just add something to that? I think that last thing that you were saying is really making me think about Sisters Uncut and how they're basically doing that exact project of thinking about what to do with Holloway. So Holloway used to be one of the biggest women's prison in Europe, and they occupied the visitor center of Holloway Prison in 2017, and have been engaged in with loads of other community groups, Reclaim Holloway, Beauty Out of Ashes, this attempt to rethink this like space of like trauma, the space of violence, but also to remain, like as I said before, kind of attentive to the money, and to think about like the redistributive potential of seizing funds, right? Like if we're thinking about what can be done in the meantime, I like this whole kind of mantra of just like steal what you can and redistribute it, rather than getting stuck in this loop of like, well, there's nothing we can do, the institution remains, etc., etc. Thinking about where money might be most useful or where resource might be most useful is always a good place to start.
Thank you so much. I feel like we touched on so many different themes there. I made different notes about the points. Some of them that stuck out to me was this link with improv that you mentioned, because I've been doing improv for like a year and a half, and as soon as I entered into the space, the way that they teach you, as you mentioned, the whole yes and, if anyone's seen things like Whose Line Is It Anyway, improv shows like that, the yes and methodology, that can't even say the word, methodology, it felt really decolonial, like being in the space. And so, yeah, I think that's a really interesting link. And again, bringing in the link to anarchism, and I was reading Scott's book like on the train this morning in preparation. And one of the chapters of How to End Things speaks about the flexibility that anarchism promotes. I'm not going to try and paraphrase your work to you, but if anyone wants to have a look at the book, there's some really brilliant breaking down some of the stuff that we're talking about in that chapter. So thank you very much for the links to that, and for summarising how we can imagine otherwise and how we already are. So we've finally moved on to the section which is the Q&A. So thank you for coming on the journey with us and bearing with us through that. I'll give about 2 or 3 minutes for people to kind of have a moment to pause and reflect and think about the questions that you want to ask with intent. And just to also reiterate how we're going to be running, or to explain how we're going to be running the Q&A. So obviously we've got our colleagues on Zoom, and we'll be triaging through those questions to ask them in the space. And we will have a roaming mic. We'll gather about 3 questions at a time to direct to the speakers. And we'll be operating progressive stack as well, so I'll be kind of picking people out, and then also just making sure to have that space, think about your question, and to think about how it's contributing and adding to the space, and being mindful of that as well. So just a few minutes whilst we transition to Q&A.
Maybe remind people what this is.
Maybe I should.
Yeah, there are toilets space out the back door as well. There's a little space you can catch a breather in front of the rooms.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the initial point that, yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so that you will.
I like to do it, but.
Yeah, I think it's very.
The question builder.
Oh, yes. So thanks everyone. If you can just gather yourselves together again. Thank you. Find any seats. Do we have the mic? Yeah, we do. Brilliant. So I'd like to invite any of you who feel like you'd like to contribute to today's discussion with a question. Please do phrase as a question. Sometimes it can be difficult when we can't understand what you're trying to say. So in the politest way, please do try and phrase it as a question as well. So thank you. Yeah. Yeah, in the back. Thank you.
Hi, I was just thinking of how the yes and part and how abolition is continuous. So I was wondering, how can we create spaces of solace or reflection in the midst of abolition, or can abolition be used to create spaces of stillness?
Thank you. Should we take one more as well? If there's, oh, we've got one over in the corner, and then we'll take one from online. Oh, is there someone over there that I'm missing? Yeah, just in the corner. Thank you.
Hi, it may be a very simple question, but since experts, I need to ask it. I find it hard to imagine abolition without anarchy and anarchy without abolition. So I was wondering if you could discuss a bit the relationship between these two.
Shall we take one online? Thank you, Gretchen.
Oh, yeah, it's not an online question.
Oh,
It's been my question. Thanks so much for all your reflections so far, and I'm really pleased that Lola, you mentioned Sisters and Cup, because I think that's where I first met you, and I always see you at various demos and Cult Watch demos and so on, and also Reed, I think, even though we're colleagues here at City, the first time I met you was at the picket line or rally at SOAS, and then I saw you at the Abolitionist picnic this summer, right?
Yeah.
So I wondered if anyone in the room thinks, okay, I'm an abolitionist, I'm ready to get into this stuff. Like, are there any groups or any like networks that you can suggest, or where can people who can people get joined up with and get active in this?
Thank you. Let me know if you want me to repeat any of the questions. So we've got question about groups and networks to join spaces, imagining abolition without anarchy or anarchy without abolition. How do those interact with each other? And the first question about places of solace.
I think I have some ideas for the first question at least.
Is that my work?
This is my work.
Yeah.
Yes. So the question about stillness, when Natasha sent the initial questions over, my initial response to the first question of like, what am I working on abolishing, is actually urgency and time. So I think that like we are taught under particularly like capitalism and carceral capitalism specifically to respond to everything with a sense of urgency. And obviously like thinking about abolition or any other political cause that we have at the moment, like we are in a moment of crisis, and so there is a demand of like kind of immediacy or urgency around that. But like I often talk, like when I talk about like particularly transformative justice as like an avenue of abolition, about like soft skills with like a lowercase s rather than like the big TM skills of abolition or transformative justice. And one of those skills is written about quite beautifully by Kai Cheng Tong, about moving at the speed of love or moving at the speed of justice. Unfortunately for me, I understand things best as like a corrective, which is something I'm working on. So I often tell this to myself or to my partner or to my friends about like learning how to not move at the speed of panic. And so actually like taking the time when harm enters my life, or if I harm someone else or someone harms me, to try to not move at the speed of panic and instead move at the speed of love or justice, and actually allow the room for transformation and change to happen. And so that's kind of the places where I found like that solace and that patience and that grace is actually that abolition demands that we change how we interact with each other. And so that solace is coming from giving everyone autonomy and grace and patience to change and listen and respond to each other in a different way than how like carceral capitalism demands we move through the world.
We'll leave the middle question for you. I can do the last question. I was thinking about different groups, and actually what first came to mind was, I don't know whether people in this room are familiar with Abolitionist Futures, which is like a reading group, but also a resource space all about abolition specifically in the UK. So on there you can find like loads of resources relating to abolition in the UK, but also if you're somebody who's like new to abolitionist concepts. They give you a really like great kind of walkthrough. And I recently did an event with Abolitionist Futures where they basically went into the archive and unearthed these magazines from this group called Radical Alternatives to Prison, which existed in the UK from the late 70s to the late 80s. And this was a group of people, I guess this also connects to your question about stillness, who took the time to reflect on what carcerality was doing to their local areas and their communities, but also provided a great analysis and critique of these questions that we often hear as abolitionists. So questions around sexual and gendered violence, questions around the state and the state's role in knitting together these violent systems, questions around like children and the family in terms of what prison does, and also about all of the logics that are used by the state and other institutions to like maintain cultural like hegemony, I guess, to make it seem like the prison is something that must exist and must always exist. So I would really, like, if you're interested specifically in the UK about abolitionist histories, I'd also encourage you to look into the history of groups like OAD, the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent, who, whilst they wouldn't call themselves explicitly abolitionists, worked with the Brixton Black Women's Group and the early members of the British Black Panthers against forms of police and state violence. So that's a good kind of ideological start. And then, as Reed has said earlier, there have been a huge, there's kind of been an outpouring of the creation of cop watch groups in different local areas. So I know the cop watch group in Islington is very active, in Hackney, like N15, and those are all groups that have emerged because the state in the UK is moving to introduce or is in the process of introducing this bill that would really secure police power, essentially. Like, I won't go into it, but it's terrible and you should look it up yourselves. And then I'm thinking about Sisters Uncut, and I'm thinking about Swarm as well, the sex worker advocacy and resistance movement. If you're a sex worker, that's somewhere you can join. There's also London Renters Union. These are all groups that I think are knitted together in the kind of two sides of abolition, the presencing, right? Like, so groups like the London's Renters Union are looking at like, what would it mean if people had their housing needs met in terms of like reducing the likelihood of them being criminalized. And then you have groups that are working against like de-arresting people, that are trying to give people skills to be able to critically intervene in situations on the street when and where they see them. So these are all like groups that I would encourage people to either look up and join. And I guess to kind of remember that like a lot of the questions that people have about abolition as an ideological concept are often answered in the process of organizing with others in like, whether it's via mutual aid or whether it's via like political and or collective organizations. And so if you find yourself leaving this room with more kind of questions and answers, you will find them in those spaces.
So I'll take the anarchy question. But I mean, I want to build on what both of you said. Like, the first thing, coming from what Lola just said, you know, we have to imagine that the process of transformation changes us, right? Because if we, and for me, this is an anarchist like ethic, that like we don't know exactly where we're headed. And if we did know, like, if we could know, you know, the end goal, we'd either be there or we wouldn't be like living, right? We'd be like automatons or something like that. So like that in the transformation something happens. Also, like what Reed said just like hit me because it's something that I need to learn myself, to not respond in panic and to have moments of calm. And in a way, like the book that I wrote was me trying to teach myself stuff that I could embody and habit. So okay, does abolition mean anarchy? You know, I would say yes. The word anarchy sometimes is used to mean like chaos or something that we don't want, but for me, anarchy is something to be desired. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's like safe or safety, right? The police in the States, I don't know, like they have this idea of the thin blue line between like chaos and order, or anarchy and order, right? And they pose themselves as the way that we you know, keep at bay the chaos that that they teach us to be afraid of all the time, which is usually like it's racialized, it's class-based, all these things, right? For me, yes, so abolition would mean, like, if we are abolishing the police and prisons, like I said earlier, we would need to be abolishing the state, because the state functions through these means. Though I don't like personally care if people use the word anarchy or anarchism, like I'm not married to the term. I've taken it up for specific reasons because I think it gets a bad rap, and I think it offers alternative ways of thinking about things. But people are doing anarchistic stuff all the time without calling it that, and that's important to know. And it's actually like, you know, going back to the early ideas like Kropotkin, like people, or like more recent British people like Colin Ward, like people tend to do things in anarchistic ways when they're left to their own devices, when their order is not imposed upon them. But what I wanted to say in terms of thinking about abolition, and this is something that like I think it's like, you know, a critical point and people have disagreements on, right? Like in a transformative justice-oriented like paradigm, can we hope for a world like without violence, without danger? I don't think so, right? Like that's the state promises us like security while maintaining a world built through violence. But like, you know, in an abolitionist or anarchist world, there'll still be problems, there'll still be violence, there'll still be conflict, and we'll have other ways that we might have to deal with it. It just might not be, I mean, would hopefully not be systematized in the way that it is now, through things like race and gender, through the state and the market. So my answer short is yes, and that's a good thing.
Should I keep this mic with them and I'll use this one? If we can take any questions online, that will be channeled through Gretchen. Thank you.
All right, Dom is asking, I was interested in this discussion of abolition of healthcare institutions. I'm wondering how we fight to abolish the carceral elements of healthcare systems at a time when complex institutions like the NHS are under threat and need our defense.
Do we have another question in person as well to complement? Yeah, we've got a question in the back. Thank you.
Oh, hi, thank you. I'm Iris from SOAS doing gender studies and law. And I really agree with one of the audience earlier talking about abolition gender. But the thing is, gender is rooted in nation states and capitalism and everything. If we want to abolish gender, like we have to abolish like what we talked about earlier, nation states. But like we're talking like in academia or theory, but how are we going to narrow down the gap between theory or like academia and grassroots, and how are we going to take actions to really make a change? Because like this is center law and social change. And I want to know what we can do like, to really achieve the goal. Yeah, thank you.
Was that a hand next to you as well? Did you? No, sorry, that was me. And then anyone else?
I would like to know what you think about the idea of abolishing cars in the system of traffic.
Okay, so let me just repeat those. So we just heard thinking about transport, abolishing transport, cars, I guess movement in that sense. A question on taking action, moving from theory to change. And then first question was about gender. I don't know if I wrote that in the right order, about abolishing gender states as well. Thank you.
When there was healthcare.
Also, yes, I have written that in the wrong order. It was about, that was the online question, wasn't it? Yes, sorry, about healthcare systems. Thank you.
Happy to bring that. So abolishing healthcare systems, I guess there's a difference for me, I guess maybe in like thinking about NHS as a structure and NHS as a workforce. And like, I wonder what it would look like I guess for me, the way I draw that line is like, how can I support like the nurses union or the junior doctors as they go on strike, while also being critical of like the infrastructure in which they work. I am gonna hazard a guess that this question might be from one of my supervisors, and please forgive me because I know I've owed you a lot of work. I have started reading a new book called Health Communism that it's largely US based, but does also engage with the NHS quite, I think, rigorously, and it's essentially a communist analysis of how we created the concept of health, as health emerges as a metric with which we measure our labor capacity rather than our wellness or our care or our well-being. And like, yeah, I think, and when I think about like ways that we enact the abolition of healthcare, I think about the ways that in this country, for example, trans people share information on how to access healthcare within, outside of, and sort of parallel to, in the way that the question asker, I think earlier was talking about like the ways that you can sort of sidecar into types of NHS healthcare, like that there's an intense network of sharing information. I actually like just last week met with someone who I didn't know who had said like, oh, they're an American that's trying to access healthcare. Like, does anyone know anything about this? I was like, yes, actually, yes. It's not going to be good, but I can at least say, here's what I've done. But like those networks of care exist, or the ways that like groups like the Campaign for Psychiatric Abolition have done workshops at like the Dawson Solidarity Cafe, which is another great sort of mutual aid organization if you're interested in getting involved there, on like how to intervene or support friends going through crisis, and like all of these things kind of exist both next to, within, and outside of the NHS. And so, yeah, I try to think about protecting worker rights while also acknowledging that the system within, that they function within, needs to be abolished and radically restructured as a way of managing care rather than managing our capacity for labor. And then I have this thing about the praxis question, but I will pause.
It's okay, or do you want to?
I just wanted to, on the healthcare question, I was thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about how during, like, part of the abolitionist analysis is thinking not only about what needs to go, I guess, from our current healthcare system, but the ways that healthcare continues to be kind of securitized by the state. So like during the pandemic in the UK, the government made it much easier to like detain people and section them essentially. And if we think about Section 8 as a form of like racialized violence in this country, because it is, I think like Black men are something like 5 times more likely to be sectioned than anybody else. Then that allows us to be strategic in thinking about the ways that we navigate what we know is in a way a dispossessive system, whilst also providing solidarity with workers, and also thinking about the pressures on healthcare professionals. So there are all of these, going back to this concept of refusal, like refusing to collude with prevent in your workplace, right? Like thinking about rejecting this logic of being a burden on the NHS, thinking about the ways that the government has like during the pandemic and continues to utilize a really eugenicist logic to think about who deserves access to care, and to think about, as you said, health as a capacity for labor. I think that that's also part of the abolitionist project. So it's not as much as like, it's not as simple, I guess, as saying that like, oh, you know, the NHS needs to be abolished. Well, yes, of course, in some like meaningful sense, but it's also about thinking about where the reallocation of resource can happen first in some sense.
Yeah, so we like lived on under imposed scarcity, right, where there are actually resources that enough to go around. And so like one of the things that I keep thinking about but haven't said, and we've all sort of been touching on, is that like everyone should have the things that they need, right? That includes, that's like the basics of like shelter and food and and then forms of care, right, which could be medical or other kinds of care, and then also like pleasure and desire and all these things too. So like, but thinking about the kind of praxis question, I feel like often we get into dangerous territory, especially like when people think about revolution as this kind of punctual thing that like happens and like and everything changes, because it involves often like forms of like murderous sort of you know, hinging on genocidal logics. So like I've been envisioning sessions like where we like are like trying to create abolitionist like non-state worlds, and like people are just sort of like, yeah, so people who need pharmaceuticals to live just die, right? Like, and they can just say that. And like I'm someone who relies on medicine to be well and to live. So like I'm like, okay, so like that world is not a world that I can live in. So I think like when thinking strategically, and this is going back to like what Reed was saying, like there are things that exist right now, right? We can use them. And the more people who are involved in them that we can get to kind of understand, to like share and to rethink their roles within them so that we can use them better to meet our needs rather than the way that the system is trying to allocate them or restrict access to them. This is true for the university as well. I think like I'm part of a collective called Abolitionist University Studies, and we're like, what does it mean? Does it mean just like destroying the university? No, like this is a thing that exists that like is that we can use in ways and play with, right? So we have to think about like practically like that all these different locations where you can choose anyone. It's going to be consolidating forms of power, and think about how you can like try to spread the access, try to spread resources. I really also like the way that you brought up like trans people are a good example of like people who know how to you know, use the system for the needs that they want. I mean, it doesn't always happen. There's a lot of violence, right? And there's like, I'm not trying to like idealize anything, but like just that like under the current systems, trans people have had to learn ways to get where they want through like sort of bending rules or producing like the thing that's needed to get the access. Yeah, I don't know. I have other things I can say, but I'll end there.
I think on the grassroots bridging between the university and the grassroots, sorry, the bridging between grassroots and university. I think this is an interesting question because I feel like in a way it's a question you could ask yourself about the locality of where you are, where in this institution, thinking about workers' rights, thinking about the strikes, for example, and like whether students have come together to provide support and solidarity for staff, whether students are, you know, fighting back within these, you know, this institution's walls against the continued marketization of higher education, because inevitably those are all things that are connected to this question of gender and nation states. I think sometimes it's easier to work backwards from huge abstract concepts in some sense, like the nation state, gender as an idea, to how do we abolish that, rather than thinking about the localities that we exist in and how those are how like the university might still be a space for transformation, gendered or otherwise. I sometimes I struggle with trying to think about, I think about the histories of universities as spaces of violence, but I also think that universities have often been made most useful when they've been used against their original purpose and function. And that's only something that requires a group of people to come together, whether it's like a radical reading group or whether it's like a fundraiser or whatever. There is still like agency within the when you're navigating these like violent structures in some sense. And also I think it's maybe good to look at some historical examples of the ways that people have thought about like guerrilla intellectualism, or like have thought about ways to spite the university in spite of its function, because it gives you some sense that is still possible. I think like the ideological elements of marketization have so seeped into universities in the UK that it's near impossible to think of fighting back, but it absolutely is in a meaningful sense.
Yeah, actually, I kept thinking of, there's a book by Stephen O'Harney and Fred Moten called The Undercommons, which is about fugitive planning in the university, and there's that line that they have in it, which is, to the university I'll go, to the university I'll steal. And yeah, as we were talking, also thought about like SOAS detainee support or no more exclusions as well, if we're thinking about like abolitionist frames of education, grassroots organizing that's happening there. But I did want to also respond to the car question as well, and thinking about how landscape has been a theme running between us all. I guess I don't have like, I mean, I have a general sort of like car bad, train good thing, which might just be like a chip on my shoulder from like coming from a country that doesn't really have a rail network. But also like thinking about things that you don't see when people talk about putting mass rail in America is like, how many like treaty protected territories would a mass rail network have to go through to be made possible in America, and thinking about that kind of thing. But I guess to your question, like if we remake the landscape and the vision of abolition, how necessary does it become for us to move in the ways that we have been moving? And I will use this chance to plug a really great fiction book that came out, I think at the end of last year. It's a fake oral history of North America and the rest of the world after communizing revolutions. And you know, it's called Everything for Everyone. And it really made me think about like what happens after revolution and like how communities are put together. And yeah, so I guess like I see the question of like cars and fossil fuel transport kind of as a thing that will radically change as we remake the world.